In the heart of a gritty metropolis, where the skyline sparkled with promise, but the streets echoed with unspoken tensions, Calvin Carter, a prominent entrepreneur, lived a life many envied. His high-rise apartment boasted floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a symbol of his success in the fast-paced tech industry. Yet behind the facade of wealth lay a troubled relationship with his much younger partner, Aaron Cole, a college student who struggled to find his footing in life. Calvin was known for his charm and intelligence, having built a lucrative startup that revolutionized mobile applications. He exuded confidence, always dressed in tailored suits and sporting the latest gadgets. But beneath his polished exterior, Calvin harbored secrets that would soon unravel in a shocking act of violence. Aaron, at 21, was fresh-faced and eager, a student studying sociology. His charismatic nature drew people to him, yet he often felt overshadowed by Calvin's larger-than-life personality. Their relationship had started innocently, with late-night conversations over glasses of wine that turned into heated kisses. For Aaron, being with Calvin meant entering a world of luxury, where he was whisked away to upscale restaurants and extravagant events. Yet as time passed, he began to feel the weight of Calvin's expectations. Calvin's desires often took a dark turn. He introduced Aaron to an array of unconventional sexual practices, pushing boundaries that made Aaron uncomfortable. What began as playful exploration soon morphed into a source of conflict. The age difference and power dynamics blurred the lines between consent and coercion. Aaron felt trapped, struggling to maintain a semblance of control over his life while succumbing to Calvin's increasingly demanding desires. One evening, after a lavish dinner at an exclusive restaurant, Calvin invited Aaron back to his apartment for what he claimed would be a special surprise. Excitement danced in Aaron's chest, but the thrill soon faded as Calvin's intentions became clearer. Calvin began to suggest that they explore a new dynamic, one that involved Aaron being bound in a particularly vulnerable position. "We're going to try something new tonight," Calvin announced, his voice smooth yet commanding. "Trust me, you'll love it." Aaron's heart raced with trepidation. "I don't know, Calvin. This feels a bit much," he hesitated. "Just relax. I promise you'll enjoy it once you let go," Calvin insisted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. As Aaron reluctantly agreed, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Calvin bound Aaron's wrists and ankles, positioning him in a way that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. Panic coursed through Aaron's veins as Calvin's demeanor shifted from passionate to predatory. What began as a moment of intimacy quickly escalated into a nightmare. "Calvin, stop. This isn't what I signed up for," Aaron pleaded, his voice quivering. Calvin ignored him, lost in a frenzy of desire. The man who once felt like a protector now became a source of fear. Aaron's desperation turned to rage as Calvin continued to push boundaries, taunting him with every passing moment. "Just let go, Aaron." "Stop fighting me," Calvin said, his voice dripping with condescension. With every tug of the restraints, Aaron's sense of self slipped away, replaced by a primal instinct for survival. The ropes that bound him became a metaphor for the relationship itself, a web of control and manipulation that had ensnared him. The laughter that once filled their encounters faded, replaced by a suffocating silence that echoed through the room. In a moment of sheer desperation, Aaron snapped. He summoned every ounce of strength and rage within him, breaking free from the restraints. In his fury, he lunged at Calvin, their eyes locking in a moment that felt like eternity. Striking Calvin repeatedly, Aaron unleashed the pent-up frustration and fear that had built over months of emotional turmoil. "Stop! Get off me!" Calvin shouted, the surprise evident on his face. The tables had turned, and he found himself on the defensive for the first time. But Aaron was no longer the submissive partner he had transformed into a force of nature. The feeling of being controlled gave way to a surge of power as he pinned Calvin to the ground. The struggle that ensued was violent and chaotic, their bodies entangled in a brutal dance of life and death. Aaron's fingers wrapped around Calvin's neck, driven by a mixture of rage, fear, and the desperate need to reclaim his autonomy. Calvin's struggles weakened, his body growing limp beneath Aaron's grip. As he finally let go, staring at Calvin's lifeless form, the reality of what he had done crashed over him like a wave. The world spun, and for a moment, time stood still. The man who had once represented an escape from his mundane existence was now gone, and Aaron was left standing in the aftermath of a horrific crime. Panic set in. He frantically searched the apartment, grabbing whatever valuables he could find. In a haze, he collected Calvin's prized possessions, his sleek laptop, expensive watches, and the latest iPhone, anything that could provide a semblance of control in his spiraling reality. The thrill of the theft mingled with the terror of his actions, a chaotic blend of fear and adrenaline. Once he gathered the stolen items, Aaron slipped out of the apartment, leaving behind the remnants of a life shattered by a single night. He took Calvin's motorcycle, its powerful engine roaring to life as he sped away, adrenaline coursing through his veins. But the reality of what he had done loomed over him like a dark cloud. In the early hours of the morning, Calvin's co-workers began to worry. He was known for his punctuality and prompt communication, and when he failed to respond to messages, concern grew. A few colleagues decided to visit his apartment, their unease escalating as they discovered the door locked from the inside. "Something feels off," one of them murmured, ringing the doorbell repeatedly. No answer came. Alarmed, they called the police, who arrived swiftly. Officers forced their way inside, the eerie quiet engulfing them as they navigated through Calvin's lavish home. When they reached the bedroom, horror struck. Calvin lay on the floor, cold and lifeless, a victim of his own desires. The police secured the crime scene, collecting evidence. Calvin's naked body bore signs of a struggle, and the missing valuables pointed to robbery. A preliminary autopsy revealed the cause of death as strangulation, suggesting a sudden and violent confrontation. Detectives immediately began piecing together Calvin's life, exploring his personal relationships. Their investigation led them to Aaron, whose name surfaced during interviews. Friends recalled the young student's presence in Calvin's life, a seemingly perfect match turned sour. As the detectives delved deeper, they discovered Aaron's online activity. He had made several purchases with Calvin's stolen bank card, his spending habits painting a picture of someone trying to outrun their past. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood captured Aaron parking the motorcycle, further tightening the noose around his neck. When the police apprehended Aaron, he initially maintained his composure, denying any involvement in Calvin's death. However, as the detectives laid out the evidence, the facade began to crack. Under pressure, Aaron's resolve crumbled, and he confessed to the murder, recounting the harrowing night that led to the fatal confrontation. "I didn't mean to kill him," Aaron stammered, tears streaming down his face. "He pushed me too far." In court, the trial became a spectacle, drawing attention from the media and public. Aaron's defense claimed that he had acted in self-defense, trapped in a controlling relationship that spiraled into violence. They painted him as a victim of circumstance, manipulated by a man who used his wealth and power to dominate. However, the prosecution argued otherwise, presenting a case that emphasized Aaron's premeditated actions following the murder. They highlighted his immediate attempts to cover his tracks, including stealing Calvin's possessions and using his credit card. The jury wrestled with the conflicting narratives, the tension palpable as they deliberated. In the end, the verdict came down to a question of morality and intent. Despite the defense's attempts to frame Aaron as a victim, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and robbery. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise from unchecked desire and control. As the gavel struck, sealing Aaron's fate, the courtroom fell silent, a collective breath held in the weight of the tragedy. Lives had been irrevocably altered, dreams extinguished in a whirlwind of violence. Calvin's death left an indelible mark on the community, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of glamour and ambition. And as Aaron was led away, shackled and broken, the echo of his screams mingled with the memories of a love that had turned fatal, forever marking him as a man who succumbed to the worst of human impulses. It was a warm, sticky evening in early July when 16-year-old Clara Duvall vanished without a trace from her family's farm just outside the small southern town of Sallow Creek. The cicadas were buzzing in the humid air, and the scent of wet earth from an earlier rainstorm still clung to the fields. The kind of evening where the horizon stretched far beyond the eye could see, and the quiet made the town feel even more isolated than it already was. Sallow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets had a way of lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. The Duvalls were a well-known family. Henry Duvall, Clara's father, ran the local feed store, while her mother, Rachel, was the kind of woman who volunteered at the church, organized bake sales, and helped raise money for the town's small school. Clara was their only child, a spirited, curious girl with a stubborn streak and a love of books. That night, Clara had been at the town's annual summer festival. It was the biggest event of the year in Sallow Creek, a time when families came together to enjoy barbecue, games, and live music. Clara wasn't particularly thrilled about going. She would have preferred to stay home, but her parents insisted. "You need to spend time with people your age," her mother had said. Reluctantly, Clara agreed, meeting up with her best friend, Evie Jacobs, at the festival. The festival was crowded as usual, with laughter and chatter filling the square. Clara and Evie made their rounds, playing games, grabbing food, and catching up with friends. By 9:30, Clara was ready to leave. She said goodbye to Evie and began the short walk back to her family's farm, just a mile down the road. She had done this walk countless times before, and even in the fading light of dusk, it felt familiar. As she approached the barn at the edge of her family's property, something strange caught her eye. A flickering light, faint but unmistakable, shone from the direction of the woods that bordered their land. Curious, Clara changed course, cutting across the field toward the woods. She had heard the stories about strange lights in those woods for years, but no one had ever been able to explain them. Some said it was just fireflies, others whispered of something more supernatural. Clara, ever the skeptic, wanted to see for herself. But as she reached the tree line, the light vanished. She paused, waiting, but nothing else happened. The woods stood silent, dark. And then, without warning, Clara disappeared. When Clara didn't come home that night, her parents assumed she had stayed with Evie. But when they called the next morning and learned she hadn't been there, panic set in. Henry and Rachel Duvall contacted the local sheriff, Roy Daly, who immediately organized a search. Within hours, the entire town was buzzing with the news. Clara Duvall was missing. Sheriff Daly had been in law enforcement for over 30 years. He was a quiet, methodical man, not prone to dramatics, but something about Clara's disappearance unsettled him. Sallow Creek was a small, peaceful town. Kids didn't just vanish. As the search expanded, volunteers combed through the fields, the barn, and the thick woods behind the Duvall farm. They found nothing, no sign of a struggle, no footprints, no discarded belongings. Clara was simply gone. Then, 2 days later, they found something. Clara's necklace, a simple silver chain with a small pendant, was discovered snagged on a low-hanging branch near the edge of the woods. It was the first real clue, but it only deepened the mystery. The necklace looked as if it had been ripped off, but there were no other signs of a struggle. For weeks, the search continued, but no other clues surfaced. Rumors spread like wildfire through Sallow Creek. Some said Clara had run away. Others speculated that she had been kidnapped by someone passing through. And then there were those who whispered about the lights in the woods. The old stories of something dark and ancient that lurked just beyond the town's borders. But Sheriff Daly wasn't interested in rumors. He focused on the facts. He interviewed everyone who had seen Clara that night, combed through her belongings, and followed every lead. Nothing added up. Clara had been a good kid, no enemies, no boyfriend, no reason to run away. She had been planning to go to college in a year, excited about her future. It didn't make sense. Months passed, and eventually the search was called off. The town moved on, but the Duvalls never did. They hired private investigators, put up flyers, and pleaded with anyone who might have seen something, but there were no answers. Clara had simply vanished into the night. A year later, in July, everything changed. A construction crew working on a new highway about 30 miles outside of town made a grisly discovery. Buried in a shallow grave, they found the remains of a young girl. The body was badly decomposed, but the necklace found with it confirmed the worst. It was Clara Duvall. The town was rocked by the news, and Sheriff Daly reopened the case. The autopsy revealed that Clara had been murdered, shot in the back of the head at close range. The discovery shifted the investigation from a missing person case to a homicide, and Daly knew he had to act fast before the trail went cold again. The first person Daly questioned was Martin Carr, a drifter who had been in Sallow Creek around the time of Clara's disappearance. Carr had a history of violence, and several people recalled seeing him at the summer festival. Daly tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. Carr was a wiry man in his mid-40s with a scruffy beard and hollow eyes that never seemed to focus on anything. He denied any involvement at first, but under pressure, he cracked. Carr confessed to killing Clara, claiming she had come to him that night in the woods, wanting to run away. But something about his story didn't sit right with Daly. Carr was a known liar, and his details were vague, inconsistent. He seemed almost too willing to take the blame, as if he wanted the case closed as quickly as possible. Daly wasn't convinced. He dug deeper, searching for anything that might link Carr to the murder. But despite Carr's confession, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. It was as if Carr was trying to take the fall for someone else. Then Daly remembered the lights. Several witnesses had mentioned seeing strange lights near the woods the night Clara disappeared. Most dismissed it as folklore, but Daly couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. He began to look into the old stories about the lights, searching through town records, interviewing older residents who might remember more. That's when he stumbled onto something unexpected. Years ago, long before Clara's disappearance, there had been rumors of a hidden moonshine operation deep in the woods behind the Duvall farm. The lights, Daly learned, had been used as signals by the smugglers to indicate when it was safe to transport their goods. The operation had supposedly shut down decades ago, but what if it hadn't? Daly's investigation led him to Earl Patterson, a respected member of the community who had known the Duvall family for years. Patterson was a large, imposing man in his 60s, with a booming voice and a reputation for being a straight shooter. But beneath the surface, Patterson had a darker side. He had been involved in the old moonshine business, and according to several witnesses, he had ties to Carr. When Daly confronted Patterson, the man laughed it off, dismissing the sheriff's questions as nonsense. But Daly wasn't so easily swayed. He continued to dig, and soon, the pieces began to fall into place. Patterson had been running an illegal operation in the woods for years, using the lights to communicate with his partners. The night Clara disappeared, she had stumbled upon one of their meetings. They couldn't risk her telling anyone what she had seen, so they killed her. It wasn't just Carr who was involved. Patterson had orchestrated the entire thing, using Carr as a scapegoat to throw off suspicion. But with the evidence mounting, including several witnesses who had seen Patterson near the woods that night, Daly finally had enough to arrest him. The town was in shock as the truth came out. Earl Patterson, the man everyone had trusted, had been hiding a dark secret for years. Clara's murder had been a cold, calculated act to protect his illegal business, and Carr had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. With Patterson and Carr behind bars, Sallow Creek could finally begin to heal. The Duvall family, though devastated by the loss of their daughter, found some comfort in knowing the truth. Clara had been a bright, curious girl who had unknowingly walked into a web of deceit and danger. But now, the people responsible for her death would pay the price. Sheriff Daly stood outside the Duvall farm one last time, watching the sun set over the fields. The woods, once a place of mystery and fear, now felt different. The strange lights had disappeared, and with them, the darkness that had hung over Sallow Creek for so long. Daly took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure. The case was solved, the crime finally put to rest. But the memory of Clara Duvall would stay with him forever, a reminder of the dangers lurking just beyond the surface of even the quietest towns. James Miller had always been an idealist. At 27, he had worked hard to secure a job at Globalcorp Limited, one of the most trusted logistics companies in the city. Ever since joining as a junior administrative assistant, he believed he was part of something good. The company had a spotless reputation, priding itself on ethical practices, community engagement, and sustainable operations. It was the kind of place where people felt lucky to work, at least that's what James thought, until everything changed. The CEO of Globalcorp, David Kane, was the epitome of success. A self-made man, he had built the company from the ground up and earned respect across the industry. Kane was well-spoken, with a calm demeanor and a reputation for fairness. His employees saw him as a figurehead of integrity, and James was no exception. In fact, he admired Kane. To him, Kane was a man who had done everything right. Someone James aspired to be like. But admiration didn't pay the bills. Despite the company's success, James found himself in a personal financial crisis. Mounting debts, failed investments, and rising living costs left him struggling to make ends meet. His job at Globalcorp was stable, but the paycheck wasn't nearly enough to pull him out of the hole he'd dug himself into. His rent was late, his bills piled up, and the weight of it all was suffocating. No matter how hard he worked, it never seemed to be enough. Desperation has a way of clouding judgment. After weeks of sleepless nights and agonizing over his finances, James began to think of ways to fix his situation. His thoughts became darker, more desperate. What if he could take something from the office? No one would suspect him. He'd been a loyal employee for years. His boss, David Kane, trusted him. And Kane's office, he knew, held plenty of valuables. It was risky. But James was running out of options. His back was against the wall. Early one morning, before the office opened, James decided to make his move. He arrived at the building hours before anyone else, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. His hands shook as he unlocked the door and slipped inside, the quiet of the empty office amplifying his every step. The sleek, modern design of Globalcorp now seemed cold and unwelcoming. The polished floors echoed underfoot as James made his way toward the CEO's office. David Kane's office was a symbol of success. The mahogany desk, the expensive artwork on the walls, and the luxurious leather chair all served as reminders of Kane's wealth and power. As James stepped inside, he felt a pang of guilt. This was a man he had looked up to, a man who had given him a chance when no one else had. But desperation drowned out the guilt. He needed to survive. James began rummaging through the desk drawers, looking for anything of value, cash, jewelry, anything he could quickly take and sell. He was so focused on his search that he didn't hear the approaching footsteps until it was too late. The door creaked open. James's heart stopped. Panic surged through him as he looked for a place to hide. The only option was a large cabinet near the back of the office, tucked into a corner. Without thinking, he darted behind it, pressing himself flat against the wall. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his ears. Two men entered the room. James recognized one of the voices immediately. It was David Kane. The other voice belonged to a man James had seen around the office on several occasions. He didn't know the man's name, but he knew that this individual frequently met with Kane behind closed doors. Their meetings were always short, their conversations private. James had never thought much of it, until now. The two men stood near the desk, their voices low but clear in the silence of the room. "We need to deliver the children as soon as possible," Kane said, his voice tense. "The cops are starting to get suspicious. We can't afford any delays." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Children, what was Kane talking about? His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The other man, his voice a deep, unsettling growl, responded, "Tomorrow, at the old construction site. You'll get the payment there. After that, the next batch needs to be ready. No mistakes this time." James's stomach turned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kane, his trusted boss, the man he had looked up to for years, was involved in something horrific. Human trafficking. The idea was too monstrous to grasp, but the words were unmistakable. They were selling children. Kane and the unknown man exchanged a few more words before leaving the office. As the door clicked shut behind them, James remained frozen behind the cabinet, his mind racing. His whole world had just crumbled. Everything he thought he knew about his company, about David Kane, was a lie. When the coast was clear, James stumbled out of his hiding place, his legs weak beneath him. He needed to get out of the office, away from this nightmare. But as he walked back through the building, the gravity of the situation weighed on him. He couldn't just walk away, he had to do something. But what? For the next few days, James struggled with his next move. He couldn't report Kane to the authorities without proof, and the risk was too high. He'd be marked as a thief if Kane turned the situation against him. But as he observed Kane in the office, James noticed the same secretive behavior, the same visits from the unknown man. It was all connected, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something truly evil was happening right under his nose. James knew he needed to find out more. He needed to catch Kane in the act, to gather evidence that could expose him once and for all. His chance came a few days later when he overheard Kane talking on the phone about a meeting at the old construction site, the same one mentioned in the earlier conversation. That evening, James followed Kane. He kept his distance, staying in the shadows as Kane drove to the abandoned construction site on the outskirts of town. The site was a decaying skeleton of a project that had been halted years ago, now overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rusting metal frames. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting. James crouched behind a pile of debris, his heart racing as he watched Kane arrive and meet with the unknown man. Their conversation was short, but what James overheard chilled him to the bone. The unknown man handed Kane a briefcase. "The payment is all here. The next order is for 25 children. Make sure everything is clean this time. Payment comes after delivery." James felt sick. His worst fears were confirmed. Kane wasn't just involved in illegal activity, he was at the heart of a human trafficking operation. The company James had worked for, the company he believed in, was nothing more than a front for something far darker. As James backed away, desperate to escape before he was noticed, his foot slipped on a loose piece of rubble. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. Kane and the unknown man turned, their eyes locking onto James. Panic surged through him, but before he could run, the unknown man pulled out a gun. 3 shots rang out, echoing across the empty construction site. James collapsed to the ground, his vision fading as the world around him went dark. 2 months passed. James's body lay hidden at the construction site, undiscovered and forgotten, until one fateful night. A homeless man, stumbling through the streets in a drunken haze, made his way to the abandoned construction site, looking for a place to sleep. As he wandered through the dark, his foot caught on something solid. Curious, he knelt down, squinting in the dim light. What he saw made him sober instantly, a decomposing body partially covered in debris. The man ran to the nearest police station, his heart pounding with fear and excitement. The discovery of the body sparked an investigation that quickly caught the attention of Sheriff Morgan Tate, a seasoned investigator known for his tenacity. Tate took over the case, determined to uncover the truth. He identified the body as James Miller, an employee of Globalcorp Limited, and began his investigation by questioning David Kane. From the moment he met Kane, Tate's instincts told him something was off. Kane was calm, too calm, and his answers were rehearsed. Tate dug deeper, collecting evidence that painted a different picture. CCTV footage showed Kane's frequent meetings with the unknown man, and phone records placed Kane at the old construction site on the night James disappeared. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. When Tate confronted Kane with the evidence, the CEO crumbled. Under pressure, he confessed to his involvement in a human trafficking ring. He told Tate everything: how James had overheard the conversation, how the unknown man had killed him, and how they had tried to cover it up. With Kane's confession in hand, Tate set a trap for the unknown man. Using Kane as bait, he arranged a meeting at the old construction site. The unknown man arrived, unaware that the police were waiting in the shadows. As soon as he stepped out of his car, Tate and his team surrounded him. The unknown man reached for his gun, but the officers were quicker. He was arrested on the spot, and the human trafficking ring was dismantled. Justice was served, but the cost was high. James Miller's life was lost, a casualty in a dark world of lies and corruption. The company he had once believed in was gone, exposed for what it really was, a front for something much darker than anyone could have imagined. In the fog-laden town of Coldwater Falls, nestled between the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, the murder of 16-year-old Lila Chambers shattered the illusion of peace. For years, the town had been a quiet place where everyone knew their neighbors, and crime rarely extended beyond a petty theft or the occasional bar brawl. But on a crisp November morning in 2016, Coldwater Falls woke up to a nightmare it would never forget. The discovery of Lila's body near the abandoned sawmill sent shockwaves through the community. Her broken frame lay among the overgrown weeds and moss-covered ground, evidence of a violent struggle. It was a jogger who found her, a local teacher named Jane Carter, who could barely comprehend what she had stumbled upon. Lila, known for her love of photography and quiet nature, had been brutally murdered. For a town like Coldwater Falls, the incident was inconceivable. The horror of the crime rippled through every corner, casting long shadows over families, friendships, and reputations. Detective Jonah Pierce, a man known for his relentless pursuit of justice, was called in from Seattle to lead the investigation. Coldwater Falls, lacking the resources and expertise to handle such a grisly crime, turned to Pierce, a hardened detective who had built a career out of solving the unsolvable. His reputation preceded him, as did his gruff demeanor. Jonah Pierce wasn't a man for small talk. He was known for being methodical, analytical, and fiercely determined to crack any case that came his way. When Pierce arrived in Coldwater Falls, the town already buzzed with gossip. Some believed the culprit was an outsider, a drifter or transient, someone who had wandered into town and committed the heinous act before disappearing back into the woods. Others whispered about Lila's troubled home life. Lila's mother, Tessa Chambers, was known to have struggled with alcohol abuse, and the town had often seen her stumbling out of bars late at night. There had been rumors of arguments between mother and daughter, ugly fights that could be heard through the thin walls of their modest home. The Chambers family wasn't new to tragedy. Lila's biological father had died in a car accident when she was just a toddler, leaving Tessa to raise her alone. The arrival of Miles Barrett, Lila's stepfather, a few years later seemed like a fresh start for the family. Miles was a successful businessman, He had a way of making people feel at ease, always with a reassuring smile or a pat on the back. But as Pierce dug deeper into the family's history, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Lila's death weighed heavily on Coldwater Falls, and the police were desperate for leads. At first, suspicion fell on Tessa. The town's gossip mill churned out stories of her drinking problems, her volatile temper, and the constant tension between her and Lila. Some neighbors claimed to have heard shouting matches from the house, late-night fights that ended with Lila storming out and Tessa slamming doors. To many it seemed plausible that Tessa, in a drunken rage, could have harmed her daughter. But Pierce wasn't so sure. Something about the scene of the crime didn't sit right with him. The location where Lila was found was too calculated, too deliberate. Whoever had killed her had taken the time to hide her body, to stage the scene near the sawmill. It wasn't the act of someone in a drunken frenzy. This was cold, methodical, and personal. Pierce believed the killer knew Lila well, and he knew the answer to her murder lay somewhere within her inner circle. Pierce began his investigation by talking to the people closest to Lila. Her friends described her as a quiet, introspective girl who had a deep love for photography. Lila was often seen wandering the woods with her camera, capturing the eerie beauty of Coldwater Falls. She had been a gifted student, and despite her difficult home life, she dreamed of attending art school in Seattle. She was a loner by nature, but she had an artistic soul that drew people to her in subtle ways. As Pierce dug into Lila's past, he discovered that in the months leading up to her death, she had become more withdrawn, spending more time alone and growing distant from her friends. She had stopped attending school regularly, her grades had slipped, and her once vibrant passion for photography seemed to wane. Her friends noticed the change, but none could pinpoint what had caused it. Something had clearly been weighing on Lila's mind, something she had kept hidden from everyone around her. One name kept coming up in Pierce's interviews: Miles Barrett. Everyone spoke highly of him. He was seen as the doting stepfather, the man who had saved Tessa from a life of hardship and given Lila stability. But as Pierce spent more time in Coldwater Falls, he began to notice the cracks in Miles' perfect image. The more people spoke of Miles' charm and generosity, the more Pierce's instincts told him to dig deeper. Lila's mother, Tessa, was a wreck when Pierce interviewed her. Grief and guilt had consumed her, and she had become almost catatonic in the days following Lila's death. She admitted to their arguments, acknowledging that she hadn't always been the best mother, but insisted she would never hurt her daughter. Pierce believed her. The look in her eyes was one of raw pain, not the kind of cold calculation that matched the brutality of Lila's murder. The breakthrough came when Pierce gained access to Lila's personal belongings, including her journal and camera. Flipping through the pages of her journal, he found scattered entries that painted a picture of a young girl deeply troubled by something she had witnessed but didn't know how to confront. In her last few entries, Lila hinted at a secret she had uncovered, something that had shaken her to her core. She mentioned betrayal and secrets, but she stopped short of naming names. Pierce knew Lila's camera could hold the key. When he developed the film from her last photos, his suspicions were confirmed. Among the images of Coldwater Falls' haunting landscapes were several photos that raised alarms. Lila had captured a series of clandestine meetings between Miles Barrett and a woman who wasn't Tessa. The woman, Meredith Cole, was a local realtor and longtime friend of the Barrett family. The photos showed the two in intimate moments, their secret relationship unfolding in the shadows of the woods near the sawmill. With this new information, Pierce began to piece together the motive. Lila had discovered Miles' affair with Meredith and, not knowing how to handle the situation, had kept it to herself. But as time went on, the weight of the secret became too much for her. She had confronted Miles about it, threatening to expose him to her mother and the rest of the town. Miles, a man whose reputation was everything, couldn't allow that to happen. The night of Lila's murder, Miles had returned home earlier than he had claimed. Pierce tracked down surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that showed Miles' car leaving Coldwater Falls at an odd time. As his alibi unraveled, and the fibers found on Lila's clothing matched those from one of Miles' expensive suits. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. When Pierce confronted Miles in his office, the mask finally slipped. At first, Miles denied everything, trying to maintain his calm, collected demeanor. But Pierce was relentless, laying out the evidence one piece at a time. Miles' face grew paler with every word, and his once confident facade began to crumble. It didn't take long for him to break. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Miles said, his voice shaking. "She found out about Meredith. She was going to ruin everything. I didn't know what else to do." The truth was uglier than Pierce had imagined. In a moment of rage and desperation, Miles had confronted Lila after she threatened to reveal his affair. They argued, and in a fit of uncontrollable anger, he lashed out, killing her in the woods where she had discovered his secret. He had then staged the scene to look like an attack, hoping to cast suspicion elsewhere, perhaps even on Tessa, whose troubled past would make her an easy scapegoat. Miles was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was swift and the jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Meredith Cole, though not involved in the murder, was left to deal with the fallout of their affair being exposed. Her reputation in Coldwater Falls was destroyed, and she quietly moved away, leaving the town behind. As for Tessa Chambers, the weight of losing her daughter and the betrayal by the man she had trusted was too much to bear. She left Coldwater Falls not long after the trial, seeking a fresh start somewhere far away from the memories that haunted her. Detective Jonah Pierce returned to Seattle, but the case stayed with him. He had seen the worst in people before, but this case, a case that involved betrayal, family, and the death of an innocent young girl, left a mark on him. Coldwater Falls, with its misty woods and small-town charm, had revealed itself to be a place where darkness could hide in plain sight. The town, once close-knit and trusting, now looked at each other with suspicion. Miles Barrett had been a man they all admired, a man they thought they knew. But behind closed doors, he had been hiding secrets that ultimately led to the destruction of his family. Coldwater Falls would never be the same. The murder of Lila Chambers would forever be a scar on its soul, a reminder that even in the quietest of places, danger can lurk just beneath the surface. Nora Evans had always felt like life in the small town of Lancaster was a waiting room, holding her back from the bigger things she was meant to do. At 35, she had returned to the town after a few years of working as a journalist in the bustling city of Hallcrest. The job there had been intense but unfulfilling, mostly puff pieces and corporate write-ups. She had burned out and returned home to catch her breath, hoping to find inspiration in the quieter rhythm of Lancaster. Most of her work as a journalist for the Lancaster Gazette was focused on local events, town hall meetings, small business openings, and the occasional local scandal, which hardly ever amounted to much. She had friends in town, and her routine was comfortable, but the gnawing feeling that she was meant for something more kept her restless. Then she met Owen Cray, and everything changed. It was a rainy autumn night, the kind of evening where the streets glistened under the lamplight and the smell of wet leaves hung in the air. Nora had gone to Sullivan's, the local bar, after a particularly tedious day at work. She wasn't expecting anything exciting, just a quiet drink and maybe some small talk with the bartender. Owen had been sitting at the end of the bar, nursing a drink. He wasn't from Lancaster, that much was obvious. His sharp suit, the way he held himself with a quiet confidence, he seemed out of place in the small, working-class town. He introduced himself casually, his voice smooth and calm, his eyes flicking over her with just enough interest to catch her attention. They got to talking and Nora felt an immediate connection. Owen told her he was in town temporarily, working on an urban development project just outside of Lancaster. He rented a house on the outskirts of town, near the woods. There was something about him that drew Nora in. He seemed mysterious, world-weary, but grounded. He listened when she spoke, asking about her work and her ambitions in a way that made her feel understood. For the first time in a long time, Nora felt like someone saw her not as a small-town journalist, but as someone who could be more. Their relationship developed quickly. Within weeks, they were spending nearly all their time together. Owen was charming, kind, and attentive. He made her feel like her life could be bigger, like the things she dreamed of achieving were within reach. And more than that, he made her feel alive, like she had found something worth holding on to. But as time passed, little things began to bother her. Owen would disappear for hours at a time without explanation, sometimes leaving in the middle of the night to take phone calls from unknown numbers. When she asked about them, he would brush her off, saying it was just work. His behavior seemed increasingly erratic, but whenever she tried to press him for more information, he'd smile, kiss her on the forehead, and say, "You worry too much, Nora." At first, she told herself that it didn't matter. Everyone had secrets, and she didn't need to know every detail of his life. But as the weeks went on, her unease grew. The phone calls became more frequent, and Owen's absences started to last longer. Sometimes he would come home late, his shirt wrinkled, his face tense. But when she asked him where he had been, his answers were vague and evasive. Then one evening, after Owen had left on yet another unexplained errand, Nora made a decision. She couldn't live in the dark any longer. She needed to know what was going on. The next day, while Owen was at work, Nora drove out to his rented house. It was a small, isolated place, tucked away in the woods on the edge of town. She felt a knot of guilt in her chest as she let herself in with the spare key Owen had given her, but her curiosity overpowered her sense of right and wrong. Inside, the house was sparse, almost sterile, as if Owen had never planned to stay long. The furniture was minimal, and there were few personal items around. It didn't feel like a home. In the back room, she found a locked desk drawer. Her hands trembled as she searched through the drawers in the kitchen, finally finding a small key hidden under a pile of loose change. When she opened the drawer, her heart sank. Inside were stacks of documents, files, and photographs. At first glance, they didn't make sense. There were maps, blueprints of buildings she didn't recognize, and notes scribbled in a language she couldn't read. But then she saw the photos of people. Some of them were local business owners, others were people from out of town, and a few were of her colleagues at the Lancaster Gazette. They weren't casual shots, they were surveillance photos taken from a distance, documenting their movements, their meetings, their lives. And then there were the other photos, darker ones. Photos of people tied to chairs, their faces bruised and terrified, their eyes wide with fear. And in the corner of one photo, standing over a bound and gagged man, was Owen. His expression was cold, emotionless. This wasn't the man she knew. This was someone else. Nora's stomach twisted with fear. What the hell had she stumbled onto? Her mind raced as she quickly shut the drawer and left the house, trying to process what she had seen. Owen wasn't who he said he was. He was involved in something dark, something dangerous. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't go to the police, not yet, not without more proof. But she couldn't confront him either, not until she was sure she was safe. For the next few days, Nora acted as if nothing had changed. She went to work, spent time with Owen, and tried to pretend she hadn't seen those photos. But her mind was in a constant state of panic. Every time Owen looked at her, she wondered if he knew what she had discovered. She began sleeping with the door locked, just in case. But she couldn't keep it up forever. One evening, after another tense dinner, she finally snapped. "Owen," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." He looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" "I know about the files," she said, her heart pounding. "I saw the photos. I know what you've been doing." For a moment, Owen didn't move. He set his fork down, his face calm, but his eyes darkened. "You shouldn't have done that, Nora." She swallowed hard, her fear rising. "I had to." "What are you involved in, Owen? Who are those people?" He stood up, walking to the window, his back to her. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. "Those people, they were dangerous." "What does that mean? What gives you the right to hurt them?" He turned to face her, his expression cold, his voice low. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you, bigger than both of us. I'm doing what needs to be done." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're a monster." Owen's face hardened. He took a step toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I can't let you leave, Nora." Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "You know too much," he said, his voice calm, terrifyingly calm. "I'm sorry, but you shouldn't have looked." Nora's instincts kicked in. She bolted from the chair, rushing toward the front door, but Owen was faster. He grabbed her arm, yanking her back with a force that knocked the breath out of her. She screamed, struggling against him, but his grip was like iron. The struggle lasted only moments, but it felt like hours. In the end, it wasn't the fight that ended it, it was Owen's hands around her throat. Nora's vision blurred, her breath fading, and the last thing she saw was the cold, emotionless look on his face as he took her life. When Nora's co-workers noticed she hadn't shown up to work in days, they called the police. Lancaster was a small town, and people didn't just disappear without a trace. Detective Daniels was assigned to the case, initially expecting it to be nothing more than a misunderstanding. People left town all the time. But as he began looking into Nora's life, he realized there was more to the story. Nora's friends told Daniels about Owen, the mysterious man she had been seeing. None of them knew much about him, except that he was new to town and that Nora had been acting strange in the days leading up to her disappearance. Daniels visited Owen's house, but it was empty. There was no sign of Nora, and no sign of Owen. But when they searched the house more thoroughly, they found what Nora had seen: the files, the photos, the evidence of Owen's criminal activities. And in the basement they found Nora's body, hastily hidden beneath a pile of old furniture. The town was shaken to its core. Nora, their friend, their colleague, had been murdered, and the man responsible was gone. Detective Daniels worked tirelessly to track down Owen. The evidence left behind in his home told a story of a man involved in a larger criminal organization, something that stretched far beyond Lancaster. Owen had been part of a network that dealt in extortion, blackmail, and worse. He had been collecting information on powerful people, using it to control them. And when Nora had discovered the truth, she had paid the price with her life. A nationwide manhunt was launched, but Owen Cray had vanished. Weeks turned into months, and while the network he was part of began to unravel, Owen himself remained a ghost. The case haunted Detective Daniels, but more than that, it haunted the people of Lancaster. Nora's death became a scar on the town, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, danger could still lurk. Eventually, a lead came through. Owen had been spotted in another town, using a different name, blending into the background as he always did. Daniels and his team closed in, finally bringing him into custody. Owen was tried and convicted, but for Nora's friends and family, the damage had already been done. Nora had wanted to write the big story that would change her life. Instead, she became the story, a cautionary tale of love, trust, and betrayal. The people of Lancaster mourned her, but they also feared the darkness that had come into their town, knowing that the man they had let into their lives had been capable of such horrific things. Even with Owen behind bars, the shadow he cast over Nora's life and her death would never fully lift. Chloe Weston, a 30-year-old mountain researcher, arrived at the remote town of Elder's Peak, nestled deep in the shadow of the towering Graymore Mountain. The town was as isolated as it was beautiful, untouched by the hustle of the modern world, with its narrow cobblestone streets, faded wooden signs, and air of mystery that hung like mist over its buildings. Chloe's reason for coming here was simple: science. She had been hired by a geological research agency to study the unique rock formations in the region. Graymore Mountain had a storied history, shaped by millennia of natural forces, and Chloe was eager to explore the ancient landslides and rocky peaks that held valuable clues to the Earth's past. The assignment was set for 7 days, enough time to gather the data she needed and immerse herself in her passion. Upon arriving, Chloe rented a small, cozy house on the outskirts of Elder's Peak. It was quiet, just as she liked, perfect for unwinding after a long day of research in the wilderness. The town seemed frozen in time with its quaint, untouched charm. She felt like she had stepped back into another era, where life moved slowly and secrets were buried deep within the silence. Her first few days were spent diving into her work, mapping rock formations, documenting changes in the landscape, and trekking to remote areas of Greymore to collect samples. It was physically demanding, but mentally exhilarating. Every crack in the rock told a story, and Chloe was determined to uncover as many of them as possible. It didn't take long, however, for her to notice her neighbor. Dylan lived in the house next door, and though the two exchanged only brief glances in the beginning, Chloe couldn't help but be intrigued. He was a rugged man, likely in his late 30s. She often saw him working outside, chopping wood, tending to his garden, or tinkering with his old car. He seemed to prefer his own company, much like Chloe, though there was something about his silence that held a quiet intensity. As the days passed, they exchanged pleasantries, nods of acknowledgement, polite smiles, the occasional wave from across the yard. Chloe thought nothing of it at first. She wasn't looking for anything more than a quiet, productive week. But on the third evening, after returning from a particularly long day of climbing steep trails and collecting geological samples, Chloe faced a problem. Her car wouldn't start. Frustration bubbled up as she tried again and again to turn the ignition, but the engine only groaned in response. It was already late, and she still had data to log before nightfall. Stepping out of her car, she noticed Dylan standing near his own vehicle, wiping his hands on a rag after what seemed to be another round of repairs. Chloe, normally independent to a fault, hesitated before walking over. Dylan. "Hey, do you have a minute?" she called out, her voice carrying over the still evening air. He looked up, surprised, but walked over without hesitation. "Looks like something with the engine. I can't fix it right now, but I can give you a lift if you need." Chloe hesitated, but she was already running behind schedule. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Dylan replied, flashing a rare smile. The drive was surprisingly pleasant. The conversation flowed easily between them, much to Chloe's surprise. They talked about the town's history, the mountain's quirks, and their work. Dylan seemed to know a lot about Elder's Peak, its secrets and its solitude. He wasn't much of a talker, but when he did speak, it was with a quiet confidence that made Chloe feel at ease. Over the next few days, their encounters became more frequent. Each morning, Chloe would prepare for another day in the mountains, and Dylan would wave to her from his porch or greet her with a casual morning as he worked on his car or tended to his yard. Small talk turned into longer conversations. One morning they shared coffee, talking about life outside of Elder's Peak. Chloe told him about her work, her love for the mountains, and the sense of purpose she felt in uncovering the Earth's ancient past. Dylan listened more than he spoke, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet understanding, that made her feel as though he saw more than he let on. By the 6th day, Chloe found herself thinking about Dylan more often than she expected. There was a connection between them, subtle but undeniable. It came as no surprise then when Dylan invited her to dinner at the town's only restaurant that evening. The restaurant was small and rustic, with dim lighting and a cozy atmosphere that felt almost out of place in the otherwise quiet, somber town. Chloe arrived a few minutes late, but Dylan was already waiting for her at a table by the window. His smile when he saw her was warm, almost disarming. They shared a meal that felt more like a celebration than just dinner. Conversation flowed easily, and Chloe found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. She felt a connection with Dylan that was both comforting and exciting, as if they had known each other far longer than just a few days. After dinner, Dylan suggested they take a drive. "There's an old mill just outside town," he said. It's abandoned now, but no one ever goes there. It's quiet, and you can see the stars like nowhere else. Chloe, feeling adventurous, agreed. They drove in silence for a while, the car winding through the dark, twisting roads that led out of town. The stars above them were brilliant, but as they approached the mill, Chloe felt a strange unease settle over her. The mill was an eerie place, its crumbling structure a silhouette against the starry sky. The building loomed in the darkness, forgotten and foreboding. Dylan parked the car and stepped out, and Chloe followed, though a sense of foreboding had begun to creep up her spine. As they stood in the stillness, something didn't feel right. Chloe's head began to swim, her vision blurring. A wave of dizziness overtook her, and she stumbled, reaching out for balance. "Are you okay?" Dylan asked, his voice distant now, almost detached. Before she could respond, her legs gave out beneath her. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was Dylan's face, his smile twisted, his eyes cold and gleaming in the pale moonlight. A month passed before the horror of what happened to Chloe Weston came to light. A local teenager, skipping class and looking for a place to hide from prying eyes, wandered into the old mill. What he found was far worse than he ever could have imagined. Chloe's body was decayed, her clothes torn, and the signs of violence clear. Terrified, the boy ran, alerting the authorities as fast as he could. Detective Joseph Quinn was called in to lead the investigation. A seasoned professional, he had dealt with gruesome cases before, but this one felt different. The brutality of the crime, the remote location, it all pointed to something darker than a simple crime of passion. The town of Elders Peak was rocked by the discovery. People whispered in fear, locking their doors at night, afraid that whatever had happened to Chloe could happen again. Joseph began his investigation by interviewing everyone in the town, starting with those who had known Chloe in her short time there. Dylan's name came up repeatedly, but when Joseph first spoke to him, he seemed calm, even helpful. Still, Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Dylan was too composed, too smooth in his answers. He said he hadn't seen Chloe after their dinner the night she disappeared, but Joseph's gut told him that Dylan knew more than he was letting on. Days of investigation led Joseph to a breakthrough. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Dylan's car driving toward the mill the night Chloe was last seen. It was the evidence Joseph needed. He went to confront Dylan, but the moment he knocked on the door, Dylan fled, bolting through the back door and into the woods. The chase was brief. Dylan, cornered, had nowhere to go. Joseph drew his gun, leveling it at the man who had hidden behind a mask of normalcy. "It's over," Joseph said, his voice cold. Dylan was arrested, and under pressure, he confessed not only to Chloe's murder but to the rape and killing of 4 other women across different towns. Each time he had used the same method, charming his victims before revealing the monster within. Elders Peak was left to grapple with the horror they had unknowingly harbored. Dylan was sentenced to life in prison, but for Chloe's family and the others, the wounds would never truly heal. If you have any crime story happens to you or your friends, then leave a comment. And don't forget to like and subscribe.